Welcome to Rally the Cause, a podcast where we learn from top leaders and marketing experts in the nonprofit world. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hi, everyone. It's Jeff Brom. I'm the host of Rally the Cause podcast, where I talk to top leaders and experts in the marketing and branding world. This episode is brought to you by Ignite. Ignite is a full-service agency focused on branding, campaigns, and digital marketing for nonprofits and purpose-driven organizations. At Ignite, we're both strategists and storytellers at heart. We partner with nonprofits that have big ideas and bold visions for the future. So if you think that we can help your organization, go to igniteaction.co or email jeff@igniteaction.co to get in touch with us to see how we can help. I want to welcome today our guest, founder and CEO of Forbes Israel, Joanna Landau. She was born in London, moved to Israel with her family when she was 5 years old. After serving in the Israel Defense Forces as a paramedic, she read law at Cambridge University, where she gained BA and MA degrees. Joanna also holds an MBA from IDC Herzliya. She's worked as a lawyer in the high-tech industry and established 2 internet startups based in Tel Aviv. In 2009, Joanna founded Forbes Israel to change the way people think and feel about Israel. Joanna is a governor of Tel Aviv University, a member of the International Education Committee of Taglit-Birthright, and a director of Tel Aviv Global and Tourism. Joanna was chosen by Forbes Israel as one of the 50 most influential women in Israel. And today she lives in Tel Aviv with her husband and 3 children. Joanna, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you.
So Joanna, tell us, you talk a lot about country branding. Why is this important and why should it matter for any country?
So in the past, when countries were presenting themselves, they sort of did it through a variety of different options, whether it's through tourism, through business, and so on. It was very much managed by the governments, and the message was really, here we are. If you like what we've got to offer, then you can experience us, and so on. This creates income for the country. So it's really important for the economic survival of a country that there are tourists and tourist dollars, if dollars is the currency, comes into the country. Investments and trade, talent, for example, is really important to be able to tell the world, look, if you're interested in relocating to a great place, we have a wonderful culture and so on, and great opportunities, and so on and so forth. So this has always been something that countries have looked for. It's as old as the pyramids in Egypt and the Roman Empire and the Greeks and so on. And it's as new as newfound countries that were established fairly recently. But what it is in a very sort of simplistic form, and why it's so important, is that it recognizes that there are choices out there. So if you are deciding where you're going to travel, your destination that you're interested in, it's not just one. It's not just one option. There are hundreds of different options. And so you need to start thinking in terms of competition. And when you start thinking in terms of competition, you need to make sure that you have a really strong and appealing brand. And so country branding is really about taking commercial and sort of corporate branding and applying it to countries for tourism, for business, for talent, as I mentioned, and really just for the general reputation of the country. Because when you've got a great reputation, that allows you to do a lot of different things, whether it's, striking up great agreements and international treaties and so on and so forth. So it's really important for the economic strength of the country, for national pride, and really it's a strategic asset.
Yeah. And, before the recording, you and I were talking about the idea of bottom-up country branding and why Israel is doing something a little bit different, or what you're doing with Forbes Israel. Maybe you could talk about what is unique about Israel when it comes to country branding, and what is this bottom-up strategy that you're talking about?
Sure. So it's kind of a little bit, it's a term that I kind of coined. I don't know if everybody's using it, but usually when you think of a country and its brand and its reputation, then of course the entity that has the mandate and is tasked with managing this reputation is the government of the country. if it's a municipality, it's a city, then it's the municipality. In Israel's case, I came across a project that was in the foreign ministry about 12 years ago, and it was called the Brand Israel Project, and I was very excited about it. I wasn't a foreign ministry representative. I didn't want to go join the government. I felt as a citizen of the country that I really would like our story to be told better, and I think country branding is the way to do it. And so I established Vibe Israel to support this project that the ministry was starting. And then as the years went by, unfortunately, in Israel's case, there are so many other priorities that took over that the project itself was not budgeted enough, not enough people, not enough strategic thinking. And unfortunately, it exists, but not at the extent that is needed for a country, certainly a country like Israel. And so I call it bottom-up country branding in the sense of when the private sector wants to support the efforts of promoting their country, whether for business or for tourism or for talent or for general prominence, then that's bottom-up country branding, because I don't own the mandate. It's not mine. I'm not representing my own company. And when I present Israel to the world, the brand that I'm promoting isn't Vibe Israel, which is the organization, it's Israel itself. And so it's the bottom-up approach is something that really is taking off. And in the last few years, we've seen this in other countries. And even if we look at Israel as a great example of private sector leadership in the business field, especially in the tech field, the ones who really made the world know that Israel is a startup nation and so on are the business themselves, not necessarily the government. The funding was not sufficient, and the government supports, but not enough. So really the people who were pushing it were the business people, because it was in their interest to do it. And so that's what I call bottom-up country branding. And I think any country would benefit from having citizens, private sector support any top-down effort as well.
Yeah, interesting. So which other countries out there are doing that we should be looking at? Who's doing it well? Who do you look at for inspiration?
Yeah. I mean, this field of country branding as a methodology, as a sort of industry, developed at the beginning of this century. It's not that it hadn't been done before, but it was what I would define as organic. Nobody called it country branding. And then in the beginning of this century, certain private sort of individuals within governments understood that you could use similar methodologies that are used in the business world. And so 10, 20 years ago, not that many countries were doing it. But today, practically every country and certainly every city has a kind of branding agency. So you gave the example of Tel Aviv Global and Tourism, of which I'm a director. That is the agency within the municipality of Tel Aviv that is responsible for Tel Aviv's global communications. And actually, I think that Tel Aviv Global, I mean, obviously I'm a little bit unobjective here, but it is actually recognized as a city, as a great brand. And that's because people are really talented and well-funded agency working within the municipality is doing a great job. So if I look at cities, those are great examples. Amsterdam does excellent marketing. If I look at countries, New Zealand is one of my biggest inspirations. And what's interesting about their branding is that it's called New Zealand Story, is the organization that promotes the brand and tourism New Zealand and so on. And they want New Zealand to be known for more better things. So New Zealand is known for wonderful scenery and beautiful nature, but New Zealand Story's responsibility is to make sure that they're known for their business and for other things that they have to offer. And of course, they are now capitalizing on the excellent image of the country due to the successful leadership throughout COVID. So those are countries I look at. New Zealand, I look at Costa Rica is a great example. It's called Essential Costa Rica is their government agency that deals with it. And there are several others that are really inspirational and doing an excellent job.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned COVID. I imagine COVID has had an impact on country branding and what the world looks like today and moving forward. How
Absolutely.
has COVID impacted this field?
So I think that COVID was, even if this field didn't exist, I thought it was fascinating at the beginning of COVID, not now that we see the end of the light at the end of the tunnel, but at the beginning of COVID, if you recall, we were singing with the Italians on the balconies, right? We were clapping for the NHS in England. We were supporting and yelling yay to the firefighters and so on in New York. And if you take each of those examples, it makes sense that you'd be singing on balconies with Italians or Spanish people, not so much German people or Japanese, right? It's not by chance that that's what we got. We learned about Italy during this time. And it's not by chance that, for example, Israel is very successful at its vaccination drive because we're particularly good. We're a problem-solving society. We're really good at getting things done. So what COVID has done, I think, has really, at a time when the world is flat, the next generation, probably has more in common with someone living on the other side of the world than they do to their next door neighbor, because that's how communication has changed. COVID suddenly introduced a new form of, and I think this is a charged word, but a new form of nationalism or national identity, which is not about borders and politics and sort of who's against who. It's more about culture and national identity. And I think that has enabled different countries to really showcase what it is that they have to offer the world at a time when, for the last several years, it's all become, the European Union wants to be Europe rather than Germany, Italy, Nordic countries and so on. Instead of COVID reminded us that there is value to culture and identity for countries.
Yeah.
And I think that is an opportunity for lots of countries to take it to the next level, especially Israel.
Yeah. And I mean, Israel has a lot of, politically and just throughout the years, Israel's, has a complex society, complex, community, but with COVID, like the country really, seemed to come together, when it came to the vaccine, which is, I think something that really stands out to me and to others who are looking at which countries really stepped up.
Yeah, I think it's a huge window of opportunity because Israel is known for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's known as the Jewish homeland and so on. And if you're not interested in the conflict and you're not Jewish or, evangelical Christian, Israel might not interest you. But actually, Israel is much, much more than that. And this is where country branding comes in, because really it's about presenting to the world, what are you good at? Like, why should people be interested in you? And I think that this is an opportunity that COVID has given us, and the successful vaccination drive. The eyes of the world are on Israel right now. Okay, Israel is the first to implement the Green Pass, this kind of passport for going back to cultural events, going back to business. And all of the media is interested in, so tell us what it's like over there so that we can learn for when we can do it over here. And if I were in charge of Israel's brand at a higher level than I am right now, which is, of course, where we're heading, then I would really view this as, what a great opportunity to invest huge efforts right now for like a blitz of communications, positive communications about Israel, because Israel doesn't have that opportunity very often. It's like once in a century. And that window of opportunity is going to close within the next 2-3 months when other countries catch up. And so I would do a lot more with what, with what we can.
Well, I hope the people who need to make those decisions are listening to you. Because
I'm sure the thing is in Israel is that there are great people, really professional people, doing amazing work within the government. The problem is, as I mentioned, the priorities are such that it's not funded very well. And it doesn't really, differently, for example, to Tel Aviv, where the mayor is like behind this effort and puts the necessary funding in. In the government of Israel, there are so many other things that seem to be more important that the reputation of the country is not considered a strategic asset. And therefore, when the budget is divided, then of course, we need to allocate funding to things that feel more important. But it's just like a company. If you don't have a great brand, then you can't do that much. And companies like yours, Ignite, that's the whole point. I mean, if you've got a great story and if you can help tell that story, then that will create goodwill and people will be willing to, do business with you and so on. Same exactly for a country. It's not enough to be good at something. You need to let the world know you're good at it, and you need to invite them to enter into a relationship with you, which is what branding a country is all about.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You mentioned Tel Aviv I think of Tel Aviv as this impressive, extraordinary brand where, people from all over the world, it's a diverse city, it's, it's welcoming and it's 24/7. It's like, kind of like the New York of the Middle East. But can a city branding kind of overstep or kind of like step above a country? And would does that work? Like, because you mentioned the mayor is really like doing great things. Like, does that happen around the world?
It does. And I think that it happens mainly because of this sort of the millennial generation and probably Gen Z as well. When you say, where are you from? You no longer say, you're from the country that you're from. You usually say the city that you're from. So certainly that's become, because the world has gone into sort of more communities and tribes, and the smaller you get, the more identity you can feel. It's much more difficult to brand a country than it is to brand a city. And yes, it can overtake, but not always. I, for example, have real tension with other people at Tel Aviv Global because I'm on the board because I can contribute and I'm a very proud Tel Avivian. But my feeling is that Israel's brand is much more than just Tel Aviv. And I think that the success of the brand of Tel Aviv kind of cannibalizes the ability of Israel as a brand to do as well. I'm sure that would change if Israel as a brand provided with the necessary resources and so on and professionally managed. But there are some people who promote Tel Aviv and sort of say, well, it's better. I won't mention Israel because of all the negative sort of stress on the brand of Israel. I'll just talk about Tel Aviv and beaches and good-looking people and the sun, and it's all fantastic in the city and so on. But I think Israel is fascinating because of Tel Aviv is an hour away from Jerusalem, and because you've got the beauty of the Galilee and the Golan Heights, and you've got the uniqueness of the desert, and because of the people, the diversity of Tel Aviv is not just in Tel Aviv; it's all over the country, and all of these different things. Tel Aviv just really did a fantastic job in sort of owning it. And it does have that unique presence, being that their sort of brand is the nonstop city. And they live up to that brand all the time. But I feel that, for example, Amsterdam for the Netherlands, you don't really think about the Netherlands. You kind of just think about Amsterdam. London for the UK, maybe a little less, and New York for the United States and places like that. Certainly there are other options available. But I don't think it's healthy when the city takes over the country brand, but it can happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you mentioned the UK. I know that England is a brand that kind of, regardless of what's been going on lately, they've had some challenging with Brexit and the royal family and other things. Yet they have, I think from what you and I were talking about earlier, they've weathered the storm. Maybe you could talk about how they've done that. And I know also you look at the Best Countries Index, which England is part of. Maybe you could talk about why you use that and how this happened for England and what it means for other countries.
Sure. So just to give context within the field of country branding, when we use the acronym KPI, which is usually key performance indicators, we actually view it as key perception indicators. So when you talk about branding the country, it's not about whether the country really is good at something or really does have, in reality, something to offer. It's more about what people perceive it has to offer. Now, of course, a strong brand, there's alignment almost between perception and reality. So if the perception is great, and then in reality, when people experience the brand, it's no good, then of course the brand will be weak eventually. But the importance is that we're not measuring facts, we're measuring perceptions. And for that, you need to use different sort of metrics. So of course, for example, Israel is a country that is very strong in innovation, the Bloomberg Innovation Index and the World Economic Forum, all these different indices that you can see about how strong Israel is. We're in top 10 as an example. But that doesn't necessarily mean the world knows we're that strong. What it's evaluating are the facts on the ground, not what people think. And so we look at, we do our own research, but we also look at this metric that you talked about, which is the US News and World Report Best Countries Index, which comes out every year. In fact, it's coming out in April, very shortly. And what it does is it ranks about over 70 countries based on the opinions of 21,000 people around the world. And those people are split up into millennials, business decision makers, and then just general population. So 7,000 of each in these 73 countries. They're given a list of questions and they answer in terms of what they imagine, different countries are like. And then you can understand what the perception is. And so when we look at England, it's always in the top 10, if not in the top 5. And you would have expected, bearing in mind what happened with Brexit, bearing in mind the situation with the royal family and all the scandals and all that, bearing in mind this last year, what happened with COVID, you would have expected England to gradually deteriorate and go down in the ranking. But because it's got such a strong brand, it's maintained, I think it's number 4 or 5. Over the years since this report was published in 2016, it hasn't gone down. And I think that's a really strong indicator of the success of the British branding effort, which is called the Great Campaign. You can go to greatcampaign. I think it's .co.uk or .com. And what that is a marketing and branding effort to promote what is England has to offer in the world. And so it's very effective. They launched it during the Olympics in 2012. And to this date, they're still using it. And you'd think Brexit, it's very hard to say, everything's great. Can't really say that anymore. But because the marketing campaign was so successful, it still works. It still has that impact. So it's very important to have, this goes back to what I said about it being a strategic asset. It helps you through the tough times. And of course, for me, talking about Israel and promoting Israel is a brand that is consistently and constantly in crisis and constantly has stress, and therefore really important to try and strengthen it and bolster it using country branding.
Yeah, and speaking of successful marketing campaigns, I do recall that Vive created something called the Doggy Vacay project, which was, when I first saw it, I was like, wow, this is definitely different and not what you expect when you think about Israel, as you just described. So first of all, tell everyone what it is. How did you come up with the idea? And what happened?
So we had been doing our flagship projects since we started is trips for online influencers to Israel. Started with bloggers back in 2011. Today it's Instagrammers, YouTubers, and so on and so forth. But we had done several of those trips to Israel. We were generating hundreds of thousands, millions of positive mentions of Israel online, and it really was going very well. And then in 2016, about 5 years later, I sort of felt I really want to do something, not just a standard tour. Let's do something really interesting and exciting. And we weren't sure what exactly to do, but we knew we had the skill set and the sort of the willingness to take a little bit of a risk. We knew that our audience is this next generation, sort of young people, 20s and 30s. That was the age group that we were looking at. And we knew how to tell Israel's story. We just couldn't come up with a really cool campaign. So we actually went with an Israeli company that comes up with these great ideas. And we said, here's what you want to do, come up with some ideas. And they came up with a few. Doggy Vacay was the idea that was most interesting to us. Turns out that Tel Aviv has the highest number of dogs per capita in the world. And the dog represents warmth, friendship, loyalty, man's best friend, all these different things that are very, very positive and emotional. And it's something that we really want people to think about Israel, because actually Israelis are very friendly and warm and caring and so on. And so we thought, let's do something around the topic of dogs. And because we were working with influencers, we, of course, knew that there were many dog influencers, meaning literally dogs that have Instagram pages with hundreds of thousands of followers. And so we did a campaign to invite, it was a competition, to invite dogs to come to Israel. And of course, their owner can come as well. So the whole campaign was aimed at the dogs, which of course is very disruptive and causes people to pay attention, which is what we wanted. We chose 6 influential dogs to come to Israel. We gave them a trip which was aimed at what do you do as a dog in Israel. So all of our trips are very specific about a topic. This one was about dogs. And then we created a video that was like a viral video, and we promoted it online. And the result was 700 million positive impressions of Israel, suddenly opening up. We to this day, it's been 5 years, to this day, I get dog owners asking if they can come back to Israel. And hopefully when we can resume our tours, we will certainly evaluate whether we can do another one. So that was just, it was really a, how do you do a disruptive campaign at a time when, everybody's heard everything. And so it's pretty original, and it certainly proved its worth.
Yeah, it's amazing. What a brilliant idea. We're going to put in the description of the podcast a link to the video. So anyone who hasn't seen it should definitely check it out. It's such a creative, innovative, interesting way to get people to think about Israel in certainly a very different way. So I wanted to ask you, we have a lot of organizations that we work with who are not only interested in engaging people, but also raising funds, because any organization needs to run and operate with funds. So Vibe Israel has Vibe Israel USA, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in the United States that raises money for the programs and activities of Vibe Israel. When you talk to, I imagine you also speak to donors who are interested in investing their philanthropic dollars in Vibe. What is it that you hear when you speak to a donor that where the light bulb goes off, when you feel like, okay, I'm with someone now who gets it, and this is connecting with them? What is that? Maybe you could tell us about what that story is.
Sure. So Vibe Israel USA's role is, it started off just as fundraising, and now we're it's almost like the ambassador for Vibe Israel in North America, because we also work with a variety of sort of organized Jewish communities to help them tell Israel's story to their next generation. And so we have the fundraising takes place in the United States, but it also takes place in Israel. And we have donors from all over the world, which is great. Always looking for more, but it's great to have what we have, and we appreciate every one of them. I think first and foremost, it's very important for anybody who's CEO of the organization to understand that they're also the fundraiser. So you've got to be the person and to kind of really get people to engage, because people give to people, and all that's a whole topic for a whole other podcast.
Right.
It's very, very difficult to convince donors to support our work, not because of what you would ordinarily think. There is a preconceived notion when it comes to the brand of Israel, or the reputation of Israel, or the image of Israel, how it can be improved. And that preconceived notion is something called hasbara. It's a Hebrew word which literally means to explain, but is sometimes translated as advocacy. So advocacy for a country is different, of course, to branding a country. Advocacy is really about explaining political and sort of policies, anything relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all those aspects of the state of Israel that sometimes require a deeper understanding in order to really relate to and be able to understand and unravel. We are doing something different. We're not saying to our audience, listen, you need to agree with us, or, if you don't agree with us, let's have a debate. And only then can we talk about business, culture, and all the rest. We believe it works the other way around. We believe that you first engage through what you do best, and you get people to like you, and you get people to build a relationship with you, and then they can understand you better and understand why you have these different policies and so on. So when I speak to donors, I feel that the ones that we have a more difficulty convincing are the ones that are used to this paradigm of you need to do advocacy for Israel before you can do these funny Doggy, Vacay and fun stuff and all the positive stuff, because the world thinks this about Israel and this is the way to fix it. And I come along and I say, well, first of all, the world doesn't actually think that. We have research to prove it. Paradigms are very, very powerful. People don't change them really easily. And they're usually not really grounded in much data. And I'm very data driven. And so we take research and we show that, in fact, the world doesn't necessarily think of Israel in a certain way. And therefore, it doesn't necessarily require us to, first of all, try to convince them that they're wrong and correct them and so on and so forth. So the ones that I feel that we can engage with are the ones that are usually more kind of corporate. They get the importance of branding to the success of any entity, whether it's a person, a company, or a place. And they relate to it at that level. And also that they have a pain point, which is that mostly in our case, whether it's Jewish community outside of Israel, they're very worried about how their next generation is engaging with Israel and also with their own Jewish identity. And Israel can really, rather than being the problem, it can be the solution, as we can see with projects like Birthright and so on. And within Israel, you have a lot of people worried about Israel's global reputation. And so those are the people that we can speak to and say to them, look, if you're willing to be a little bit innovative, a little bit disruptive, not continue doing the same thing that we've always done and expecting different results, then country branding is the way to go. And look, here's the data to prove it. Here's the fact that every other country is doing it. Join us. And so we have a few of those. Sometimes they join us because they like the fact that we're innovative and risk takers and so on. And they're sort of excited by the sort of startup look and feel. And sometimes they join us because we're really offering them a solution that they specifically need. The ones that we find the most difficult to engage with are the ones that really want things done the way it was always done, and would rather probably give their hard-earned money to organizations that do that. And that's, of course, their prerogative. And I personally believe that both types of efforts are required for a country like Israel. Israel's not like every other country. It does need what I like to call crisis management, so that's like advocacy, when someone asks difficult questions. But most people don't ask those questions, and then there's a void, and who's telling that story? And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I like to always say the data doesn't lie, right? So if you have the data that shows that most people, they're indifferent or they don't think about Israel in the way that some people may think they do. It's a compelling message to think about, okay, well then what, if that's the case, then what can we do? Like then the world becomes like kind of open and that's where the innovation can happen.
I will say because you work with nonprofits and I expect some of the people in the audience are nonprofits, the data doesn't lie in the for-profit world. But in the nonprofit world, for whatever reason, people get very emotional. And if they see data they don't like, and this has happened to us, then they will think that the data is wrong. They will find flaws in the data that to sort of ensure that their paradigm is intact and it's not broken and not shifted. And that's what makes it very difficult. And you can get sucked into doing activities that the donor thinks will solve the problem, but you know that they won't. And I find that for the last 10 years, if I listened to what donors wanted first, I would have a much bigger budget to work with, but I would be doing programming that I don't feel moves the needle enough. And therefore, I'm a little bit stubborn about it. But I think that if you look at where Israel was 10 years ago, when the Brand Israel project started in the foreign ministry and then eventually died off, and you look 10 years on, you see real results when country branding is used for Israel, whether it's with the gay community, whether it's with the tech business community, whether it's for a variety of reasons, now with COVID, all these different things. Whenever you speak about Israel positively, the world is interested in hearing what you have to say. That's not advocacy. That's branding and marketing.
Well, Joanna, the world in Israel especially is lucky to have you as a voice and as a leader. I want to ask you one last question before we go. So I just purchased tickets for my family. We're going to Israel in late December. We're very excited. And so for those who either have been to Israel before or maybe this will be a first time for them to think about going, what is one thing you think they should do that maybe is not kind of in the typical brochure about, okay, I know it's hard to pick one because so many off the beaten paths, but like whether it's an experience, a restaurant, a place to go, like give us a little taste of Israel before we sign off.
So what we found from our tours that we've done of Israel, that it doesn't matter what the topic of the tour is. We've done dozens of different types of tours, ranging from architecture to education to vegan food, whatever it is. Every tour that we do of Israel is a food tour, okay? Because the food is so good. So one of our favorite experiences is a tour of what's called the Tikva market, which means the market of hope. It's the market that really is much more than about food. And we work with a specific company called Buka Tours that we love. And they give an experience of the market, which of course is very tasty. But what you're learning is about the different waves of immigration to Israel from African countries and Arab countries, of Jewish people who came to Israel from those countries. And you're learning about entrepreneurship, about people who came with nothing and turned their lives around. You're learning about culture, and you're doing that while getting completely drunk because they keep on giving you a lot of wine, and having fun. And it's very authentic and real. That's in Tel Aviv. Of course, there are different markets across Israel, but that's the one thing that I think people confuse food experiences with the fact that it's just about food. It's not. When you do a tour of an Italian market, you're experiencing Italy. You're eating it and you're feeling it and you're smelling it, but what you're experiencing is the country and the people. And I think that's one of the best ways to experience Israel.
Excellent. Tikva market, it's on my list. I hope everyone else goes
there too. Let me know. I'll hook you up.
I will let you know for sure. Oh, you'll be here.
And another thing, if you're coming at the end of December, so I assume over Christmas, the biggest Christmas tree in the Middle East is in Nazareth. And so you're welcome to go over there. They do beautiful tours of the city. It's beautiful to see. Worth going. I
never knew that.
Yeah, because you think of Israel as the Jewish homeland, right? So,
sure.
Yeah.
Joanna Landau, thank you so much. This has been a real treat, and I enjoy always speaking to you and learning more about country branding and the work that you do. So thanks on behalf of everyone for what you're doing and for all the work of Vibe Israel. If people want to learn more about Vibe Israel or donate or learn more about what you're doing, where should they go?
vibeisrael.com is our website, and they're welcome to go there. Sorry, that was my dog. And I would also like to just take this opportunity to say that we've worked with Ignite, and we had wonderful, not just a great time with the people, but you guys know what you're doing. So I'm very honored, and thank you for having me on this podcast.
That's so kind. Thank you for sharing that. And we did have a lot of fun.
So
thanks for everything. And thanks for joining the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Rally the Cause podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.